threat at this stage, or at least no longer?
I'll cheat too by first starting with another comment before I answer that one, which is about the comment about the U.S. defense budget. We've been hearing about the difficulties we're having with sequestration today and possible budget cuts. I mean, many Americans look at the defense budget and see that we're still spending as much as the next 10 countries combined. So there might be some room to defense our defense budget or decrease it without putting anyone at risk, neither us nor our allies. So I'm not too concerned about that immediately. On the bigger issue, you could look at the U.S. pressure on the European NATO allies to keep their spending at 2% of their gross national products, not being because we plan to head for the exits and leave Europe defending itself, but because we believe our European allies need to have defense capabilities so we can work together in partnerships. What you're seeing is a pendulum swing in U.S. policy. I'm speaking now personally. This is not my government's policy. This is what I've observed. I think after 9/11 in the States, there was a mood in the States that we needed to act unilaterally. It was actually better to proceed without allies to deal with the post-9/11 era. Our traditional view is we never like to go without allies anywhere in the world. The American public strongly supports alliances. But I think now 10, 12 years after 9/11, you've seen the pendulum come back to a normal state, which is a strong belief in our alliances. So we're not looking at the European defense budgets being reduced so we could leave, so we can work together effectively.
Any comments on?
Well, I mean, nothing particularly on that. I just think, obviously, in terms of sitting here from London, looking at what the EU as an institution can do to fill some of that gap, if there is one, it is very, very, very clearly London is not wanting to engage the EU to be the mechanism to help deliver greater defence coordination. I think obviously what the EU needs to do is try and find a way, if provided the UK stays in, is to find a way to allow other European partners to use common defence and security policy as a vehicle that doesn't interfere with NATO and allows and doesn't bind the UK in. And I think obviously, it's having those flexible mechanisms that we'll talk about in a minute, but it's I think there clearly needs to be something that gets continental European partners spending more, but not just spending more, spending more effectively, so not duplicating capacity all over the shop and not responding to the threats 30 years ago, but the ones going forward. And people clearly look to the European Union to find some of that structure. But there is a very real sense that that is treading on national toes, particularly for the UK.
Ambassador, any thoughts about?
Well, it seems like it's not really my part of the world, but I can speak certainly for the relationship between El Salvador and Central America and the U.S. And we're very happy with it. And just very recently, President Obama was in San Jose and met with the regional leaders. So I think in that respect, we feel, yes, there's voices, and there's been a little bit of concern expressed through our embassies in Washington about the engagement of the U.S. in our own security issues, in our own security problems and our security strategy, which I'm going to briefly talk about because also the Europeans have been engaged in that. But overall, I think we're very happy. I think we're very happy to see that recently President Obama has really engaged, with the region. But there's always room for improvement. So far, so good.
If I may just build on what Agnes just said and hearing from the ambassador as well. When we look at the new threats which the world is facing, and of course the United States has sadly been on the receiving end of part of what a world without proper security mechanisms and without proper cooperation, particularly in this area, could see. Would the US be confident that the European Union has not only the means but the willpower, given what we see within the EU and the divergent positions and so on, to really build a proper common defense and security policy?
I think it's a matter of a habit of cooperation. I think that's developing over time. I mean, it is so much better than it was in the old days of the European political coordination system. EPC was pretty bostrict and didn't produce much. The CFSP has been much more effective. And as was said this morning, the European External Action Service is only 4 years old. It's a very new organization in terms of bureaucracies, and has already scored some notable successes. The Kosovo talks were very well done.
Any comment? Any questions from the audience? Please, if you could please introduce yourselves for the sake of the speakers.
Yeah, my name is Guam, Uche Guam from the Nigerian High Commission. You see, I'm looking at this topic towards a new European diplomatic role and status. Towards, that's the title of the topic, and the EU relations with the US, EU relations with Central America, EU relations with BRICS. You know, I'd love to ask a question, what's the EU relations with Africa? But let me just ask one question. Let me start first. Is there a particular, does EU have, as an entity, have a common multilateral and bilateral foreign policy? Do they have a common multilateral and bilateral international behavior? Do they speak in one voice in the United, let's say multilateral now, do they speak with one voice in the United Nations? Do they speak with one voice in the international organizations they're all members? You know, do they have a common relations, EU as an entity, with the US, EU as an entity including France, all the members of the EU, with the US, with BRICS, with Africa? Of course not. Does EU, when you look at, talking from the legal point, when you look at the topic itself, diplomatic role and status, the first thing that will flash your mind is the Vienna Convention. Does a country like, for example, Nigeria, grant diplomatic status, like the US, for example, grant diplomatic status to EU office in the US? Do they regard the EU, the entity EU in the US, as a diplomatic person, as they regard the embassy of the US or the embassy of the UK? You know, so these are things I thought. You know, why is it that the US does not grant diplomatic status to the office of the EU, but they grant diplomatic status to the office of the UK mission? You know, so these are just the kind of things I thought we should be discussing here, not necessarily whether they have. You know, then talk about the defense you just mentioned now. You know, I was thinking of, you know, my days in Harvard. Sorry, to talk about defense, you know, I was just thinking of EU, 90% of the people in EU are members of NATO. And NATO's policy is attack on one person is attack on everybody. So NATO covers EU. EU's expenses on defense must or should be on the decline instead of being on the rise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a technical question of how we accept the representation. And I can actually answer that because I worked on it. After the Maastricht Treaty came into force, the Maastricht Treaty says the European Union is a legal personality. Following that, we changed our practice. Heads of international organizations in Washington present their credentials to the Secretary of State. Heads of sovereign nations present them to the President. After Maastricht, we have the European Commission representative give his credentials to the President. So he's the only representative organization in the world that does that. So we recognize the European Union as having a legal personality.
But one of the things it very clearly doesn't do is have, for example, one of the things we identified in the report that we did recently was obviously not having diplomatic passports, which in certain situations can create problems for diplomats. And quite often within a delegation, you'll have certain External Action Service personnel that have diplomatic passports from their home countries if they're seconded diplomats. Sometimes certain countries will give them to their EAS staffers who happen to be from that country, and other times they happen to rely on laissez-passer, which obviously it's inconsistent within the delegation, and then obviously particularly in more volatile and complex situations, not having that security given under the Vienna Convention has the potential to cause problems. But on a day-to-day basis, most countries treat it as in the way that you just described how the US does. But obviously, in terms of function, it doesn't have consular services either. It is a unique organisation that sort of both bits of those other international organisations, but with bells on, and certain elements that will be otherwise done by states. But talk about it.
Ambassador, any opinion about how El Salvador would view, for example,
Well, I think it's the same. I think we're basically speaking same. In El Salvador, there is a representative from the EU. Actually, it's a deputy chief of mission because they have the regional mission based in Managua, and then they have different deputies in different countries of the region. So and again, you know, we see them as full-fledged, you know, diplomats, and of course, you know, there's limitations of. It's very interesting. Perhaps you might have enjoyed. I don't know whether you were here in the morning where former minister, Prime Minister Mary from Finland, I mean, she really laid out, you know, sort of like the challenges ahead of the EU, and she talked a lot about, you know, how the EU, or at least she would like the EU to look like in the future. And she presented 7 very interesting points about how the EU should, including consular affairs. Curiously, you know. So.
If I may just answer the part about Africa, the Global Diplomatic Forum has launched, you know, and is launching a series of conferences. This is one of them. Africa will be a center, will be a focal point in, you know, a forthcoming conference. So, you know, I just want to put your mind at rest that, you know, the global is really and truly well into the diplomatic forum, and Africa is coming, of course.
Adib from University of Exeter. I would like to ask regarding maybe the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the commonly feeling of the heavy U.S. shadow on the EU policy in this area. There is maybe a feeling of that the relationship between the EU and the U.S. in terms of this conflict is a relationship between not counterparts as much as it is a relationship between a dependent and a commander. So how do you interpret maybe these feelings which is commonly felt in the Middle East in general?
We worked very hard to try to get the United States policy and the European Union's policy on the Middle East peace process